I will concentrate on the Norwegian debate on this series and not so much on the history itself, although I am a historian. I will tell you something about myself before I start. I work on this fantastic institution in Kristiansand in the south of Norway, and it's called Arkivet Peace and Human Rights Center. And this yellow building used to be the Gestapo headquarters of southern Norway for 3 years during World War II. And today it's a memorial, museum, documentation and learning center. In my own research, I have been focusing on different aspects of World War II and World War II and memory as well, such as the Holocaust, civil resistance, captivity, but primarily film, cinema, and propaganda, and also historical films and the use of film in historical education. So this is something that is close to my heart to discuss then Atlantic crossing and the debate in Norway. Some of you might be well informed. Hopefully, I will say something interesting and relevant for all of you. As you all know, last year it was 80 years since the attack on Norway and 75 years since the liberation on 8th of May 1945. And the anniversary saw many book publications and releases of film and TV series, and several heated debates defined the year. And the culmination was a big debate following in the wake of the NRK series Atlantic Crossing, which premiered in November. And this level of intensity has in fact continued into this year, which has seen another debate following a new documentary series about the Norwegian war volunteers on the German side. One feature of the Atlantic crossing debate was kind of classic. Historians have pointed out errors and shortcomings based on their expertise, which has led to a discussion about the limits of artistic freedom when the narrative is based on or inspired by real events. Something new this time was that the Swedish actress in the leading role of Märta participated in the debate. Among other things, she accused historians of being aggressive and manipulative. And Norwegian historians have, for the last couple of years, been described as very aggressive. And I will try to explain some of that. There must be limits, exclaimed a clearly upset Mr. Selbekk. He's a journalist and editor and member of the State Broadcasting Council, after a meeting on November 25th last year. He obviously believed that the creators of Atlantic Crossing had taken too great liberties. The historical drama series consists, as you know, of 8 episodes. The short description on NRK's website reads as follows. Crown Princess Märta flees to the United States during World War II. A close relationship with President Roosevelt gives her the opportunity to influence the course of the war. End of quote. When the series ended up in the Broadcasting Council in Norway, even before the last episodes were broadcast, it was due to the debate that was triggered by how the series portrays Märta as a war influencer, to use the language of our time. Some historians and writers came out with some very strong criticism. It was claimed that the series was collating with fake news in the form of falsification of history and national chauvinist conspiracy. This claim was particularly related to the presentation of Märta's significance for the Lend and Lease Act, so-called, which was compared with letting the famous Norwegian resistance fighter Gunnar Sønsteby placed the bomb in Hitler's headquarters instead of Count Stauffenberg, it was said. This sarcastic critique was followed by critics who claimed that the series simply had nothing to do with reality. Here, the strong criticism was justified as necessary on the grounds that the TV drama is the most powerful form of storytelling of our time. According to these critics, the creators of the series cultivated alternative facts and ended up with a fundamentally untrue story for which there was only one possible way out: full public denial from NRK. So this was the reason why the Broadcasting Council put the matter on the agenda. And one of the main critics was invited to give a speech before the council. And online, hundreds of thousands of Norwegians could follow the event, which was covered as a political sensation. Live at 12:15, the Broadcasting Council discusses Atlantic crossing. It flashed in red war types on the website of Norway's largest tabloid newspaper. What was so bad? There is little doubt that the historians who took part in the debate achieved a great deal. One contributor wrote a widely read article which stated that the triangular drama between the president and crown prince and crown princess was part of a smear campaign led by Robert McCormick's newspaper, the Chicago Tribune, which was the mouthpiece for the America First movement. Had it not been for Atlantic crossing, this would still have been unknown to most people. Very few historians defended the series, but some did. One pointed out that it is both legitimate and fruitful to explore possibilities in history without this being a forgery. What was really at stake? I think it's tempting to see some historians' negative reactions as an expression of kind of lost monopoly on storytelling. On the other hand, something did work. A conversation did come out of it. And I would suggest seeing this debate as something of a paradox. The series is ultimately a manifestation of something very typical for our time, of the ambition of critical thinking driven to its peak, so to speak. It is the personal acquisition and use of history now that has become central. No one, it seems, own history, and everyone has the right to their own version of it. And this has some exciting implications and challenges for the historians. And I will talk about three such issues. First, relationship between the past and the present, and then I will say something about history and truth, and finally about how this series can be interpreted in any way. Okay, so I said I work at one of 7 national peace and human rights centers in Norway. So a well-functioning democracy needs a common knowledge base. I think we can agree on that. And everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but there is a difference between opinions and knowledge. And sometimes it's said, for instance, creators of films or authors of books, they, so to speak, defend themselves with that I have my own interpretation, I have my own perspective. And I think it's important to say that an interpretation or a certain perspective needs to be based on historical evidence. And another matter, of course, is that the past very much also is part of the present and is still present. I don't expect you to be able to read this. I will just show you this slide to illustrate the amount of films, Norwegian feature films, and some of the most important TV series that have been produced in Norway since 1946 about World War II. And films are very interesting as historical source and as representation of history. And films can be seen as historical products within a context of a memory culture. And in Norway, we talk about the occupation drama as an own genre. And as you can see, more than 30 films have been made since 1946. There are more to follow. Right now, as we speak, some days ago, it was announced that one of the greatest filmmakers in Norway, Erik Poppe, who made this film, The King's Choice, in 2016, he's going to make a feature film about Vidkun Quisling. And we know that there soon will be another feature film about the Norwegian war sailors, the merchant seamen. So it will never stop. And I would propose that these historical films can be divided into three main types based on the way they relate to the past. And maybe it can be fruitful to evaluate Atlantic Crossing from that scheme. So this is my typology, and maybe you will find it interesting. And also it's kind of a historicization. The first type I call time travel films, and they are the typical is that the past is a mere backdrop. These films use historical material to create a connection between the past and the present. It's not the past in itself that interests, but what it can be used for instrumentally. One takes the contemporary way of thinking and moral judgment back on a time travel to the past. All historical propaganda films are time travel films. Furthermore, many of the most famous Hollywood films from, for instance, the Antiquity also belong here. Classics such as Cleopatra from the 60s with Elizabeth Taylor, or to Ridley Scott's Academy Award-winning Gladiator from 2000. And I believe that this film, which some of you might have seen, The 12th Man, made by Harald Svart, could be seen as kind of new historical time travel film from Norway. And then the second type is somewhat different. I call them the documentary fiction films. They are oriented towards reconstructing the past. And most of the Norwegian films about World War II that were made from 1946 and well into the 60s, maybe even 70s, were such films. And they set out to be authentic testimonies of the Norwegian resistance struggle. They seek to reconstruct the past as it was. And the focus is often on events of great national significance. And two notable examples here, to the left, the poster for The King's Choice, and to the right, I think the English title was Operation Swallow, The Battle for Heavy Water. It was a Norwegian-French co-production already in 1948. And here you can see the French poster. And finally, the third type of historical films, and this is of course not just considering the period of World War II. This goes for all historical films. But the third type then I call reflective films. And these films are looking to deconstruct national myths. For instance, some of the American films about the Vietnam War made from the late 1970s belong here. And these kind of films invite to a slower and more reflective reception because the past appears as a completely different world. And it is not concrete events or physical environments that are to be recreated as accurately as possible, but certain aspects of the existential situation of the past. And communicating truthfully about the past becomes a matter of credible presentation. And this also goes for fictional films, like, for instance, The Deer Hunter from 1978. I think most will see it as a historical film because it constitutes a historically credible and trustworthy world. And here you can see the poster, or I believe from the Norwegian TV series, The Heavy Water War from 2015. It belongs to this category. And it was a typical multi-plot structure with different national perspectives, not only the Norwegian perspective, but also the German perspective. And one German physicist was one of the main characters, Heisenberg, and there was a British angle, and so on. And I will attend to the placement of or the placing of Atlantic Crossing in this respect in a minute. First, this is a still from the series Atlantic Crossing, and something that has been discussed, because what it says here is that the series is inspired by true events. And it would have been interesting to, for the experiment of thought, would it be possible to say that something is inspired by untrue events? It's unclear what that would mean. I think the truth is important as an ideal in the research process, but it's very little useful on a concrete level. For me as a historian, I very seldom speak about truth as such, but it's the ideal. Film and making film is not science, and I'm very glad for that, and we have professionals to do that. And I believe that historians should be very generous towards other storytellers. Of course, also historians have a responsibility to make sure that there is equality of the public debate. And the role of the historian has changed dramatically in the last years. It is more demanding than ever, really. And it's about so much more than facts. It's about implications of a certain point of view or a view on history, moral, political, social implications, and so on. One of the things I find quite interesting is that the story of Atlantic Crossing itself, it's not particularly sensitive or emotional or controversial. And it has certainly not been like politically marginalized, that's my view anyway, or overseen in previous decades. It's simply that now it's, for the first time, someone has made a TV series of this series, on this theme. And then I think it's very important to ask the question, what do we think is the actual meaning of this series? And I think that in the Norwegian debate has not been the focus, sadly. I think it's very important to try to see what, in fact, the creators of this series are trying to do. What kind of analysis of the past and the world is this, and what kind of values are presented or projected in this series? And I will give 3 such examples. And I think that this series deal with 3 societal, call them problems or challenges in Norway. And the one thing is monarchy, because the monarchy is not a democratic institution. So that's a problem. So that is dealt with in surprising ways, really. Märtha, or Martha, she has always been portrayed as a hero in Norwegian history since the end of the war in 1945. And in Norwegian history related to World War II, there are 2 main figures. King Haakon, he's the good one, and then Quisling, he's the bad one. And King Haakon has always been portrayed as rock solid, and he still is in these new films and TV series. So to be able to deal with this monarchy aspect as something problematic. One needs some space to do that, and the option is Crown Prince Olav. So he's becoming a very ambivalent character, and very much not based on historical evidence at all. But his role seemed very unclear, and not only in this series, but also in, for instance, the film The King's Choice. He's portrayed as jealous, unreasonable, and the government as a bunch of idiots. And it's quite surprising, really. And as I said, it's not very true according to historical sources. Also, I believe it's quite dangerous to describe politicians as clowns and the royal family as superior beings. And I think this is one of the problems with this series that I have. The second theme or issue is that the problem of a small nation. Norway is a small nation, and Norway is constantly seeking confirmation abroad. And this look to Norway is, one of our finest hours ever. But Norway seeks, of course, to use films and popular culture as a vehicle for, you may call it soft propaganda or foreign policy, and to play the role of the world's peacekeeper. This is an important national identity for Norway still, and this series is confirming this through the role of Märtha. And Norway did not play such an important role. I think that all historians that have really conducted serious research into this particular matter agree on that point. So this is quite embarrassing with regard to the export of this series to other countries. And the last and third of these problematic issues that I see is portrayed or described in this series is gender, and it's quite obvious. And it seems that the creators of this series have had like this idea: now it's time for change of the main lead. It has to be a woman now, and it's Märtha. And I'm very sympathetical to that approach. And it wouldn't have been very difficult to try to do that in a more, should I say, evidence-based way. It would have, in fact, have been still a very interesting story. So at last here, my final assessment, to call it that, I think that personally the problem I have with this series is the fundamental lack of specification of what it is and what it wants to do. It's very difficult to understand which parts are factual or not, and how ambitious really this series is anyway, artistically. It's presented as a modern reflective drama, the third of my types, but visually oriented towards the style of the documentary fiction film. So it's a hybrid of those two. And to my taste, the creators should have used more imagination, say fantasy, and handled World War II with less servility and awe, and thus handled established historical knowledge with more respect. Thanks so far.
Well, so thank you very much. Very good. I think that was a great presentation. We're going to have a lot of questions for you, but I wanted to get our other two speakers in, and then we can have a general discussion. Jorgen, you want me to start the share? Jorgen, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Okay, let me start the share screen. And
Okay,
Mhm.
that's in the middle. If you go to the top, Bill, can you go to the top?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And slideshow. Can you see?
I can
Okay.
see it. It's
Yeah.
not full screen yet, but
Is
yeah,
that full screen now?
yes.
Okay, good.
Well, yeah. All right. So, well, thanks for inviting me. My name is Jürgen Flod. I've been living well, pretty much half my year in the U.S. and half my my years in Norway, and added a few years in England in between. So it's I've been interested in history from day one, and moving so much around has actually kind of rekindled that interest, I think. Now, regarding this movie and what it means, I thought it could be an interesting thing, and I talked this over with Bill to just mention what my involvement is. Now, I was born after the war, and I don't know any royals. I met a couple of them, but my father was quite involved. And if you go to the next slide, there should be one in between. Yeah, that's the one. I don't know if you can read it, but my father was quite young when the war started in 1940, and I think he, whether it was youthful enthusiasm or whatever, but his opinions were quite clear, so clear that he eventually became wanted for what they call anti-German activities, not the kind of activities which would have put in front of an execution squad or anything like that, but definitely so not a good thing. So he left Oslo, which where he lived with his parents, grandparents, and he tried to get over to the west coast and managed to get over to England, which he did. So it took some time, but eventually he did get on the Shetland bus, as it's called today, and joined the Norwegian forces there and became member of the Norwegian Independent Company number 1, which is more famous as the Linge Company, the ones who did the heavy water sabotage and other famous actions. Now, he was not involved in any of those. He was still being trained and became a paratrooper, and then he was shipped back to Norway towards the end of the war and joined an organization or a group which was called Bjørn West, which had almost like a running fight with the Germans, from what I understand. And then he, well, he was with them until peace came. Had a kind of an interesting experience after the war, being put in charge of disarming a fairly large number of German troops. And he always said afterwards that it was very good the Germans were so disciplined, he said, because otherwise we would have been in deep trouble. Anyway, he transferred to the Air Force because he always wanted to become a pilot, and he became a pilot. And that was in 1946, got the wing, joined the squadron. Over my right shoulder, he took a part of his education in the United States. That's why the 49th Squadron. My military career, what I achieved was basically get the sharpshooter badge. That was the only thing. So he had a somewhat more exciting career than I had. And he was in 1952, he was ordered to be then Crown Prince Olaf's adjutant, which I guess in English would be like an aide, which means you basically follow the king around on all public events. The most exciting, not exciting, I shouldn't say that, but the most memorable events he became involved in was Crown Princess Märtha's funeral, and actually also Prince Carl Bernadotte's funeral in Sweden, but that's a different story. So when he, what I thought was kind of interesting, just to show, are these imitations. Now this is the first one, which is from the head of the Hofmarskalk. Actually, I'm not certain exactly what that would be, but head of the king's staff, I guess, would be the title. And this is an invitation to for a dinner at the royal castle. And it's interesting when I look at these things because there's so many invitations. Whenever they had a event or a dinner, anything like that, which was, you got a nice invitation. So I have several of these, but these are of course especially interesting today. And this is from the 21st of March 1954. So things developed very, very quickly. And I'm not going to go into the controversy about what exactly killed Princess Martha, but because I can't really add to that out of any personal knowledge. If you go to the next slide there, Bill. So this is the next one is just an imitation in the same time more or less, and it's for my dad and my wife to go to a royal dinner. And you have to remember this was 1954. I think it would be quite an honor today too, but in those days, of course, it was much more. The king's position after the war in the 40s and the 50s, of course, was extremely strong in Norway. So go to the next one. So we're now still only on the 22nd of March. And then I don't know why this is marked 13th of March, but as you see, that's when things started to go bad. So they cancel. So this is again from Hofmarskalken, that he canceled all the events have been canceled. And then of course the next one is from Crown Princess Martha's funeral. So my dad actually is at you see behind Kong Olaf and well then Crown Prince Olaf and Prince Harald, and that echelon of officers in front of the car there. My dad was one of those. So he was quite involved, and he said he was extremely tired at the time because they had to receive all this. You know, he had to follow the king receiving all these royals and this and that. So it was quite a roller ride for him. He was of course quite young at that time, also just a little over 20, 23. All right, if you go to the next one. And so this is after the funeral. I just entered that because part of my impressions of the royals, and as I said, this is really my impression based on my dad's impression. So take it for what it is. But one thing he always said was that they were quite considerate. And that's why, as Thomas mentioned, you know, I had a hard time watching this series, and I liked it, and I'll get back to that. But I had a very hard time of reconciling my impression of the royals based on my father's stories with what we saw. So this is a thank you letter from King Olaf to my dad, because, you know, which I'm sure he sent to all the people in his staff. But it's personally written, and I have because, you know, they stayed in contact, funny enough, not to the extent that they visit each other, but, you know, with cards stuff. So I have a bunch of cards, but all the Christmas cards are you can see they printed, and well, then King Olaf just had signed at the bottom, you know, so he has signed himself, and usually add a few words, you know, hope everything is well, etc. In Norwegian, obviously, and but this one, the whole thing was handwritten. So I thought that was quite significant, and it's also interesting how it is just really a month from how things start, from the planning of the Silver Jubilee to the whole thing. Unfortunately, passed. Next picture. So these are two pictures from my dad's, which I have. Unfortunately, I have them in these old frames, and they're a little bit emotional for me because my dad always had them on his wall. So I don't really want to take the pictures out of the frames because these are old frames, and if I do that, that's gonna be the end of those frames. So I used my camera and some equipment I have, and actually, it's almost as sharp as they are. They're not super sharp as it is anyway. But to the left, you see the opening of the parliament. Now, unfortunately, I don't know the exact year of either of them. There's something after the series and all the commotion about it. I think I will try to find out. The one to the right, I think it's at what is called Militære Samfunn, which is a meeting. Yeah, I don't know. Thomas probably knows better what I should call it today, but it is a military meeting place for off-duty, and they had a lot of events, etc. So my dad is sitting here on the right-hand side of well, I guess that is still Crown Prince Olaf. The one thing you can notice on his uniform is that there's two wings, because he had what they call the parachute wing, which on the Norwegian looks almost or very similar to the ones for a flight wing. So he carried both actually, the parachute wing and his Air Force wing as a fighter pilot. So that's that was the background, and I just want to show this one because it's a little bit interesting, give it a little bit of a background, and also as a background for my comments. And if Thomas can, sorry, not Thomas, Bill could just go to the last slide. So I know this may be easy to, difficult to read, but basically my comments are, and I have some of the same comments that Thomas actually. I don't have his expertise obviously, but it's a little bit of the same. So my feeling about the movie was that it was very well made technically. I mean, the way people were dressed. I think the language was a bit normal, a bit modern. They talk about superpowers. I never read that in any old books. I think that's more something that came after the war with the superpowers. In the 40s, you read about the great powers, and of course England was at the wane and the US the rise, etc. So that's one thing. But apart from that, and I don't think that's a big issue. It's probably almost good, because some of us may have had problems with this old way of talking, but that's one thing. So I think it was very well made. I thought it was also nice that they talked about Crown Princess Martha, because again, as Thomas mentioned, you heard very little about it. I mean, there were always, you heard about it, rumors about her affair, but if it was an affair. My dad, I asked him once, and he said he didn't believe so. He thought it was just, what newspapers come up with. So again, he was not involved with the royals when they were in the US. So that was just his opinion, obviously. I actually made a little comparison also with some of these other movies, and I mentioned The 12th Man and Lux Manus, and I felt they stayed closer to history or to reality or whatever you want to call it than this series. And maybe you have to, if you have a shorter time. I mean, there were movies. Here you had 8 episodes, and unfortunately I haven't seen the last one, which is being shown here tonight. But you can, of course, when you have to fill 7 episodes, you have to add some tensions, and obviously in this day and age, to add the little sort of sexual innuendo regarding, in this case, of course, the president and the crown prince as well. That's what often happens. I personally, I would prefer them not to, but I think it's very difficult to avoid it. The other section, and again, I think actually I have the same opinion there, because I felt that the characters became a bit one-dimensional, and that's something which is very easily done when you make movies. The politicians, I don't know if they came out as clowns, but they certainly didn't come out very well. Now, it's true that, as I say here, that some of these politicians didn't exactly cover themselves in glory in those April days, but some others were very resolute. And also, some of the things we like to do in Norway, I shouldn't say called like, but we have a little bit it's so easy to think things are foregone. And I mentioned about the who attacked. Well, that wasn't so obvious before April 9th. The British had mined waters, mined Norwegian waters, so that I don't know if many people actually thought they would attack, but I believe that the majority of people thought that this would be a replay of World War One. You know, the Germans would eventually take over on too many enemies, which of course is what happened, but sort of a replay, and that was not the case, of course. And I don't know if it's true, but we always used to hear that when the king's first comments when they woke him up to say that Norway has been attacked and there's fighting out in the Oslo fjord was attacked by whom? And I think that shows that, yeah, it wasn't so obvious, which it seems like today. The other thing is I feel some of the things that I also did, like I felt if I fell into the trap of, well, you know, the Swedes didn't help us at all. Well, maybe they didn't help us, but they helped us at least as much as we helped Finland just a few months earlier. So, you know, most countries, there were no formal defense agreements between these countries. And let's face it, I mean, very few countries were very heroic before they were attacked. I mean, in the US, we had that ship, I can't remember the ship with all the Jewish refugees who had been sort of basically been denied entry in almost every country, and including the US, and then sent back to Germany, where quite a few of them actually ended up in the camps. So that's the other thing. I feel that it's too easy to repeat those things today. And finally, I also felt that and Denmark also the same. You know, Denmark was a very different position. Denmark is the size of Finnmark County, probably even smaller actually. So, and with a land border against Germany, and of course, no country that had a land border with Germany did very well in the beginning of the war. The movie also, and of course, the United States has been, at least since the war, and probably from some time during the war, Norway's most important ally, because if nothing else, the war showed us that we will never obviously be able to defend ourselves fully alone against, anybody that could possibly attack us. But it was really the Norwegian forces were very British oriented. The boat that they talk about, that was a fairly small boat. This was a sub chaser, and the Håkon VII, which was donated to King Håkon on his birthday by the president. And then, of course, Martha, as we saw in the movie, was the one who accepted it. It was a very small ship, 375 tons. Norway also bought these Lend-Lease destroyers. Those destroyers are also something which are always a little bit sort of, they often make a big thing out of them in the war. But for example, the Royal Navy didn't really want them because they were old. But Churchill wanted it because he wanted to pull the United States, because Churchill was aware of that Great Britain on its own could not beat Germany, at least, you know, the way it looked until 1941. And I feel nothing against it, but I feel it's made to a certain extent, hopefully for a Norwegian or an American audience, Norwegian-American audience. They obviously want to show this in other countries. So that's my comment. But I still think these things are good, because even if they have a few things wrong, and they have certain things wrong, and there's a lot of guesswork, obviously, it creates interest in history. And my thought is also, well, I know it myself sometimes when I saw The Gladiator, which of course was not a historical piece, it was a fiction set in historical times. But you immediately, I started reading about Emperor Commodus, you know, because not an emperor you hear about. So that's my thought here too. But to go back to my experience, I didn't recognize the royals from my dad's description. I just went, he had a lot of nice little story, and I won't bore all of you with that. But he was always very, and this is Crown Prince Olaf, he was always very interested in military matters, which is shown in this. But when they went out traveling, you know, he didn't like to stop at too many places, because, you know, if he walked into a restaurant, there was always commotion. And again, you know, remember, this was a different time also. So they usually brought sandwiches. So it was my dad,
Yeah.
the chauffeur, and
Oh, yeah.
and my dad said that at the end of that, after those years at the castle, because when you're at Tomsk, you were it for 2 to 3 years, and you basically have 2 weeks of court duty, and then he was the Air Force rep, and then the Army rep, and then the Navy rep. So you had 2 weeks normal, 2 weeks court duty, and then 4 weeks normal military. That's the way he explained it to me. But one of the things was that King Olaf's really loved hard-boiled eggs. And my dad said that he started eating them. He said it took a few years before he could eat hard-boiled eggs because they always had that. And of course, you know, so he had a lot of nice stories, but they were always very, very positive. And the interesting thing was he was not really a royalist. That's that's the kind of, but he was very positive, talking about all of them, and including well, he didn't really see much to Martha because it was such a short time after he joined there, but it was always very positive and always talked about that they were very considerate and you know, very nice, down to earth, especially when you had them one-on-one, which he had on these trips. So anyway, that was my little take on the movie, but all in all, I give it a thumbs up for the reason that I think a well-made movie creates interest in history, even if it has many things wrong. Thank you. Are you muted, Bill?
Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out. I just want to thank you for your presentation. And I think it's interesting. I think a lot of you agree with the Thomas on a lot of points there, I guess. But I think the one thing is that Prince Olaf was a better person. I think he comes across as a bit stiff, a bit self-centered, and that's not the recollection of your father. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, and now we have Janet. You want to talk a little bit about the challenges of writing historical fiction. So, Janet, you can unmute yourself. Yes. We're not hearing you. We have to unmute.
Okay, have you unmuted me now? Okay, you can hear me now. So I wanted to say that I fell into writing about Norway in World War II. Very odd. And I tell people I had a dream about a man in the snow with soldiers standing around him. And a friend said, you should write the scene down. And I did. And then I realized, well, I'm in Norway because I'm writing about fjords. So immediately I hit the library. I am trained as an historian. I have a degree in history and I've worked with museums. So I really approached the whole book, the Jussing affair. I said Jossing for 24 years until I was corrected, but it's Jussing. I really approached it as a history project. I have a huge bibliography. I first started off reading general books, and actually it was this book, Blood on the Midnight Sun, which is a collection of stories, and it's written by a professor who was at Puget Sound University here in Seattle area, and it was actually formed by Norwegian Americans. And he was a professor, and the other was a professor at Oslo University. And they wrote a series of vignettes about, and it ended up being about Renan. I suddenly had my bad guy. It was also about Conrad Bonnie Svensson, the Minister for the Deaf, who I really am fascinated with, and the Shetland bus. And those elements became what became the sort of the background to the story. So I have fictional characters, and the first thing is Renan. I could get what I could in English. Eventually I was reading Norwegian with a dictionary by my side, but trying to get an idea. Because I didn't really know what he was saying or what he was doing, I created a character named Odd Sorting, and he represents the typical people who worked in Renan's organization. it turns out that the Renan's gang had $75,000 a year given to them to operate their gang. And so I created this character because I knew that Renan had this thing called, there was a kind of an agent group, but they could just go out and talk to local people and gather information that way. On CBS, I knew, as he was known as Comrade Bonnie Svensson was called CBS, I read that he was very high up in the resistance, and I found that very intriguing. He was part of the KK, the coordinating committee, and he had to leave Norway in January of '45 because he was found out. He was having meetings at his deaf school, which is southeast of Oslo, and someone fingered him. But he's so intriguing. So I could add that element about deaf culture in Norway because my character is pretending to be a deaf mute fisherman. The third one is the Shetland bus. And I almost immediately, besides doing interlibrary, I was in touch with the Resistance Museum in Oslo. And it turns out he was a young curator at the time, but he's now one of the directors of education there. I have letters from him, and it's just fascinating. He sent me the schedule of the Shetland bus because by '44, they are the submarine chasers. And so this idea of fiction, I really do work. I write really slow because I really want to get it right. And I wanted to write about ordinary people. So we have the men's chorale, Norwegian men's chorale. We have one here in Bellingham. There's a larger one in Everett, Washington. And I was given the name of men to interview. I interviewed 7 initially, and I would go out with flowers. They would give me Norwegian cheese and all kinds of stuff. I took out a map, and could they show me where they were? And I was gathering pictures. And from there, telling me their experiences, I wanted to write about what happened to ordinary people. You have all these heroic movies that were starting to come out. So the other thing that I do is I create a timeline. I get perpetual calendars that I can put in the real event and then what my character is doing. And, I can't say what Renan said, but I can say what what people around him have reported who said. And even though I wrote the book a long time ago and just recently published it 4 years ago, I did go to Trondheim 3 years ago and spent about quite a long time both at the Justice Museum and at the Resistance Museum at the Armory. I also met with Ivar Lind, who is a playwright. I didn't know how famous it was until my friend said, "Do you know who he is?" after we left. But he's an expert on Renan's gang. And so, and I think it was really satisfying to me and actually a privilege when one of my hostess friends said to me, "How'd you get Trondheim right? How did I get it right, having never visited it?" And I have British naval spy maps that were on my university shelf here in Bellingham. And they have time travel for the train. They have description, beautiful maps of the ports. And she was cracking up because we were walking back from the Justice Museum. And I said, "Oh, that's where the brewery was, the sugar factory." Well, that was on the map. And it was very satisfying years later when I could get on Google Earth that, wow, okay, I did get this right. This is here and that is here. But I also feel a great responsibility. I live in an area, I belong to the Daughters of Norway here in Bellingham, and we have people, some of them have lived, were born in Norway and have come in later. Our oldest member is 97 from Bergen. Our family was forced out of their home when they began to expand the U-boats in Bergen. And her story of having to go by a little fishing boat to get out of the area. They went about 50 miles north. Also, one of my friends who was, she's in my book club, but I was working with her as a reading teacher. Her parents were in Bergen, and her dad worked on the cars for all the you know, the Nazis there in town. And she worked at a restaurant over a bowling alley. And her story of taking the fat and skimming it off the top of the soup to get some kind of food, those little pieces really, I think, help tell the story, I hope. And I've continued. So anyway, that's what I have to say. I mean, I really do. Because I was trained as a historian, I'm very careful about marking where my resources came from. I keep meeting more people that come to me and tell me their story. One of the people, one of readers contacted me about 6 weeks ago, and he had just finished reading The Quisling Factor, which is my sequel. And he was born in Oslo. And I was sharing with him, just going back an email saying, you know, one of my heroes is Conrad Bonnie Stenson. And he said, my parents were deaf. He said there was scarlet fever in the 20s and the 30s, and both his parents got it. My parents were married in the deaf church in Oslo, and I was baptized in the church in Oslo. And I said, yeah, that was probably Conrad who baptized you and married you. I mean, the world is so small. Another person who I got to know contacted me. He lives here in Bellingham, but he was a close personal friend of one of the men I interviewed. My very first interview was Jens Olsen, and Jens was from the Bergen area, but he told me later that one of his friends who lives in Seattle, he is from Asker. And I remember going on the train from Oslo through Asker to Drammen, where I have a high school chum. And he said, yeah, his father was killed by the Gestapo. So there are lots of people in my region of the country that keep coming forward and telling me the story, their stories. And I feel really privileged that they say we're talking about this, and that's important.
Janet, thank you. I'm hopefully off mute. I'd like to sort of open this up to a general discussion now. I have some questions, but I just want to let anyone who has questions come forward. You can use the chat, or you can ask the question directly. So, any questions? Okay, I'll start. Thomas, I think an interesting question is how important Norway's role in World War II was, and that's always, when you ask that question, it's pretty hard to give a concrete answer because there's so many moving parts there. But I think one part where the Norway did make a big contribution is the Norwegian merchant marine. I mean, it's nowhere near the level of contribution in the United States or England, but it's a pretty important part of the Battle of Britain, was particularly the oil that the Norwegian tankers provided to England. Your thoughts?
Yes, sure. I think it's a well-established fact that the Norwegian merchant fleet was the greatest Norwegian contribution to the Allied war effort and the outcome of the war. There's no doubt about that. But of course, there were important key players in exile in London and also in the United States. And what I feel about Atlantic Crossing then is I agree with a lot of or everything that Jürgen said about this topic as well. I think that Atlantic Crossing is a missed opportunity to elaborate and highlight the effort of a lot of other Norwegians in this series. Märta is the one who takes all the glory, although she struggles. I think that, for instance, already in the first episode, it's very clear that the creators want to make the point that Crown Prince Olav in particular, he sees more than all the stupid politicians and even more than the high command. So he's better informed than everyone about the British mining, etc. So there's, I think there's some missed opportunities, but I also agree with Jürgen that it's not such a big deal. So maybe Märta is getting more credit than she should, but I think it's well deserved, and I have no personal problems with that. But there is a lot of research and exciting literature written on the relationship between the Norwegian and the Allies, and well, that should be plenty for future films and TV series.
Yes.
And seriously, I really believe that in the coming, it's coming a new TV series and a new feature film about the war sailors, and the topic of the war sailors is very much global or transnational. So I think that is very promising also to get a new opportunity then to disseminate more knowledge about Norway's international partners and cooperation.
We actually we did the roundtable did 2 programs on Norway sailors in the World War. We had your friend Torbjorn was one of our experts on that. So I'll send you the links on we recorded those. A very good episode. People were talking about how their father's participation in the so we had actual events on that. But yes, that's very true. Are you familiar with a book by Lynn Olson on Last Hope Island? She's an American historian, and she writes about Britain during the war. And it's about the contributions that nations like Norway, France, Poland made to the British war effort. And she sort of emphasizes that King Haakon was very much more aware of the German threat than his cabinet was. And he tried to encourage them to build up the Norwegian armed forces. Now, as Jørgen said, and I think this is pretty clear, that would probably have bought Norway a couple of days. I mean, you know, the invasion of Norway was so powerful that Norway could not have held out for much long, even if the preparation was much better. But I thought that was an interesting point.
Yeah, I haven't read that book. No, I agree. But you know, it was chaos, and nobody knew anything. We know a lot because we live in the aftermath.
Yes.
So it's easy to forget. So I think that if those were the true first words of Håkon when he woke up, who's attacking, I think those are quite appropriate words. I would have asked the same question myself. It was not so clear.
And finding the coastal harbors by Britain was an act of war.
Yeah.
That you know, that was a pretty aggressive action. You know.
It's also important to remember that Foreign Minister Koht actually declared towards the Germans that fighting already has begun, even before he consulted the High Command, the Parliament, and the King. So they were not a bunch of complete morons.
Right. No. Yeah, that's important. Just comment that there's been so much written about World War II. I think the statistic that since the end of the war, 10 books about World War II have been published each day since the end of the war. I don't think anyone has possibly could read even lists all the title, let alone read them. There's so much coming out. So did you want to talk about the Seamen's Church a little bit, or anyone talk about the Seamen's Churches, their participation in the war? That was a question. because I know, like, growing up in the 70s, I mean, being a member of the lodge in the 70s, a lot of the lodges were largely based on Norwegian seamen, like the Baltimore Lodge or the Sons of Norway. The joke is that they could have more attendance if they held the meeting in Hong Kong than if they held it in Baltimore, because so many of the members were seamen. But any thoughts on that?
If Bill, maybe I could comment.
Sure.
My father, of course, was very active in the Merchant Marine, and I was part of the earlier roundtable discussions. But the Seamen's Church was the social services as well as the sort of spiritual guide, and then the families, particularly in New York and Brooklyn. There were so many veterans and people that basically had come here, as well as the regular Norwegian Americans. The church was a critical point. I mean, my father contended that a lot of the sailors, it was their point of banking. And then when my father was sunk a couple of times, they arranged for him to be taken in with families while he recovered after the loss of the ship. So yeah, I think the Seamen's Church played a major role. I think there's not too many Norwegian seamen at sea anymore, but at least there's one or two churches still left and very active.
Okay, thank you. I'll get to some of the points. Greg says, what part of the controversy about defending the Norwegians' family reputation? Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that, Greg?
Well, the representation of the royal family is very personal. And so I wondered if the Norwegians might have felt that they needed to defend the royal family from aspersions on their and this kind of intrusion into their personal life, if that might be a source of some of the controversy about Atlantic crossing. Now we've lost Thomas now, I guess, but I kind of wonder how much of that would be controversial in Norway.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jorgen.
I don't know. I mean, well, one, of course, and this goes for many royal families, then they're an easy target in one way, because as a rule, they don't comment, don't respond. So, that's one thing. The other thing is that it is open for discussion, of course, and people have always discussed the place of royalty, as Thomas mentioned earlier. It is an undemocratic institution in a democratic country, and of course, one way you solved it is by not having. They have very little real power. I mean, in essence, the king only has one real power, and that is he can refuse to sign a law. But then, if Parliament passes the same law after the next election, with I think it has to be 4 years in between, it becomes law anyway. So it's a delay. But that was very useful in 1940, of course, because 4 years, as we all know, that was about the length of the war. So, but I don't, Norwegians has always discussed royalty. We always, out of my friends, and I still have a lot of friends and all my family in Norway, and some are very pro royalty and some are against it. I don't think you rarely hear any sort of negative things directly. I mean, of course, you have movies, some people just brush that off. But there are things that are being discussed. For example, Princess Martha, the current Princess Martha, she's has had a sort of a controversial lifestyle, joined up with a shaman. I never know what first time I heard about shamans, except in old history books, was when that guy was in Capitol with all his gear, but apparently this guy is also a shaman or something, so I don't know. So that has been a little bit, I think it's been the newspapers they try not to be too hard on the royals, because again, they can't really respond, but I think privately you hear a lot of comments about that, things like that. So how strong is the royalty? Well, I saw a comment here that one of these gallups said about 70% would have voted yes if we have another referendum or whether to keep the monarchy. Probably about 80 or 90% after the war in the 50s and 60s. So it's going down. And I think, if I was going to make a guess, I think Håkon Magnus will be the last king. Because, things are changing and he's still young, so he can rule for many, many years. So we don't know.
Okay, yeah. I lived in England for 3 years, and the British sort of look at they look at almost the royal family as members of their family, and they gossip about them endlessly. But if a foreigner dares criticize them, they become defensive. It's like your drunken aunt. You can criticize them, but don't let anybody else criticize them. But yeah, it is a paradox that
of course the British royalty.
Yeah.
I was going to say, of course, I lived 5 years in England. Of course, when you see the way the British tabloid press write about their royals compared to what you would see in Norway, there's no comparison.
Well,
as we all know, and of course, it's very easy. Yeah.
British tabloids write about anything, but particularly the royals.
That's true.
Okay. I lost Thomas, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the interesting coincidences, of course, is Jorgen's father was on the Shetland bus, which Janet has written about. You do run into all these coincidences. Make a quick note. I was contributed to the statue of Princess Martha that is in front of the embassy. And if you notice the shots of the embassy in the film, they always avoid they shoot around the statue. So, which obviously would have been a historical anachronism, but I was also present at the dedication of the statue, Princess Martha, at the Washington Embassy.
The Shetland bus is, I was going to say, as Jan mentioned, the Shetland bus. Well, I haven't seen the last episode, but the first Subchaser, the one they saw, was not one of those. Those three came later.
Right.
There was in 1943, I think they were transferred. And my dad actually went on one of those. And he was so seasick that they had to tie him to the mast because he couldn't, or not to the mast, but whatever they tied him to, because it was better to keep him on deck because obviously he was, being sick. So he said he crossed the ocean as, he was so happy when he got there. And then when he got there, the first thing they do is they put you in a camp while they investigate it, because of course there were always chances that the Germans would try to send some Nazis over under cover of being refugees, which they did or tried in a couple of cases. And his clothes were completely ruined from the trip. So he applied to when he got out, he applied to the Norwegian embassy if he could get some money to buy new clothes, but that was denied. So it wasn't different times. So he had those clothes they had been gave to him when he came, which were, I don't think too well fitting. But then when he was accepted, and they finished the investigation and he joined the army, of course, that was. But I still had that response. I kept everything from my dad kept a lot of things, and I kept everything he kept, which I'm very happy for after I started writing about history. And I still had that response from the Norwegian embassy that unfortunately they could not replace his clothes. So, it's just one of those fun things.
Do you know where he left from in Norway?
It was from the West Coast. I don't remember exactly. I mean, I have it because I have that Linge book, but it was, he had to go to the West Coast. So.
Yeah, one of the historians recently sent me the list of all the fishing boats that were part of the Shetland bus. It's all in handwritten, so I have to decipher it, but it's showing each one of the fishing boats that was the Shetland bus. It must have been a rough ride on one of those.
and much rougher because these sub chasers were fairly fast.
Yes.
And of course, there was a lot of the fishing boats were sunk. That's why they had to stop using them. They could only use them in the wintertime, but the sub chaser, not one of them, because they could cross it. You know, it's not that far. I mean, people sail across there all the time now in his time. So so that was, so he was very lucky. And then he was landed. He was not parachuted back. He was landed with one of those. And I have pictures from that. And there were three young men, you know, and they had the boat just unloaded, and then they had to carry them. I don't know how long, but it wasn't just around the corner. He said he's never been so tired because these three guys had to carry 7 tons of equipment because the boat just unloaded and left because they couldn't risk being caught by German police. They went up and down to this cave or whatever it was, and he said well, it was quite an experience for him. As I said, he was only about 19 years old, like of course a lot of the soldiers were. So, and of course being afraid of being discovered, and you know. So.
Yes, that would have been, to say the least, unpleasant to be discovered.
Yeah. Bill, John Lund here. Just one quick comment. The other, Norway was extremely poor country in these periods, and from my family's perspective, the other, let's say, near royalty group was the ship owners. I mean, this was a form of aristocracy almost inside Norway, and during the war, they play a very influential role too. I think some of the earlier comments that Jorgen made, a little bit more historical context here, might have been real helpful to a modern audience. The shipping, particularly in the war, the 1,000+ ships moving back and forth across the Atlantic, the cargo's all premium, all right, and the tanker fleet in particular was also deck loaded. And so that they had to carry not just the oil, but on their decks, they carried a heavy amount of equipment. And the ships were basically all overloaded for these journeys because the chances of getting sunk were pretty high, but from a submarine, but the chance of a storm damaging them was less. So they just overloaded them. But I think a little bit more of a context of the income streams and the negotiations. I mean, I haven't seen the final episode yet, but the episode last week, they certainly talking about Norway getting lost in the afterwar and being sort of misused. And I think the ship owners played a key role in making sure Norway was not forgotten, let's say, at the end of the war.
Okay.
You know, one of the things I thought was interesting was how Jonas Lie, or Lee, is that how you pronounce it, was portrayed at the table, because didn't he become the first secretary of the UN? I mean, he didn't come across.
I mean, Trygve
Lee, yeah.
Trygve Lee.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Jonas Lie was actually a famous Nazi. So that was same
Oh,
last
okay,
name.
sorry.
I don't know if
I've
they're
got it.
related.
I've got it mixed up. But the person that was at the table, yeah, he was bad.
Yeah,
Well, if you read Bjorn Torre's PhD thesis, which is in English, and it's titled Seafarers or War Sailors, Trygve Lie plays a very important role in making sure that the sailors stay motivated. There's something like 30,000+ sailors at sea, and it's a very dangerous situation. And Trygve Lie is sent actually by the British, who were concerned there could be a strike among the fleet at some critical point. He's sent to basically encourage them. It's a good read if you've got some time. Bjorn Torre is a very easy read. It's a good. Sometimes PhD theses are a little bit wordy. His are very succinct.
Could I make a comment?
Sure, please.
It was really never clear to me, and I may have missed something in the first or second episode of the strategic importance to Germany of the iron ore that came through Norway, and which apparently was one of the prime reasons for the invasion of Norway. And I looked it up, and I did some Wikipedia and stuff like that. And I think a lot of that, it still wasn't very clear to me what was going on. And maybe somebody could address that.
Well, I can try because I think it's often a little bit overdone because the Swedish iron ore was very important. But of course, the Germans had access to it.
It's
Also,
the Swedish ore, right?
Swedish ore, yeah, which
Oh.
is shipped through Narvik Harbor. And the production was about 1,400 tons. And then that was important for Germany. Good ore, good steel. They bought well, all sorts of steel products from Sweden, which actually the United Kingdom or England also did. Now, if you look at when the Germans started discussing the attack, the biggest proponent of that attack was the Navy, the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, as they call them. And the reason was in World War I, they had been bottled up. You know, I remember in World War I, they never conquered France. And when these discussions were taking place, you know, they still hadn't conquered France. So they only really had that little short coastline from, let's say, the southern tip of England up to Denmark that they could launch ships from. And the Royal Navy in World War I completely blockaded them. And when they tried to break out or tested if they could break out, we had the Battle of Jutland, which is, you know, many of you probably know, is the world's largest battleship duel. So that was the one thing. So yeah, it was important, but the iron ore was important, but it wasn't the only reason.
Okay.
It also became less important because a few months later, or only, you know, they attacked Norway before they rolled across France and the Low Countries. Then they attacked Norway and they finished that. And of course, the end of the campaign in Norway and France ended more or less at the same day. Then they got control of all the French and Belgian mines. So they got the iron ore from several countries. And that production was about I think 14,000 tons. It was 10 times the amount of steel they got from Germany. So in a way, that made, you know, didn't make the conquest of Norway so important anymore, at least not from the iron ore perspective.
I think then that the program rather misrepresented the importance of that.
Yeah, I guess they can't cover everything, so I guess they have to.
Got it.
I hope that helped. I don't know, but this bit.
Yeah, they.
No, it did help. Thank you very much.
One person was asking about the controversy about Princess Martha's death. I wasn't aware of it. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, the controversy, I don't know how much controversy, and to me, it's almost like a non-issue, but it's a bit unclear. You see different reasons that she died from cancer. That's what you see now. We heard from hepatitis, and I think it's, can't remember the English name for that disease. So there's been a little bit back and forth on what it was, but one, I can't see why it's important, but there's been a lot of back and forth, but I don't follow it so much. I mean, she was too young, of course, which anybody's at that age. And then, you know, really what the real reason was, whether it was this or that, I don't know. But that there's been books and things written about it, and I can't see why anybody would cover it up. What purpose that was, but I'm still not clear, because I tried before we had the meeting, because I thought maybe that would come up, and which did, and you see both things mentioned. I noticed that in most of the English now they say, like in Wikipedia and other places, they say cancer, which maybe that's the latest. I don't know.
Now, in 1955 in Norway, would there be a stigma to cancer that people may not want to disclose, or it would just be another way of dying?
I never heard. I mean, obviously, I was in 1954. I was extremely young, so
yeah. So
but I never heard that would be any The only thing I could even imagine was, that which the first when they talked about hepatitis, that she got that at a hospital in the US. So maybe they didn't want to alienate, a big nation or something like that. I really have a hard time seeing. You all know, it's strange, but for us now, if you look at the medical art in 1954, it's light years away. From
Yeah.
what we know today. So.
Oh yeah, issue there was, I think one of the things is that Roosevelt was basically wanted to aid the British, and so if Princess Martha was advocating American intervention in World War II, in a way she was talking to the choir, because Roosevelt was in favor of it. It's just that he was politically tied by the strong isolation sentiment in the United States. And I know this from my parents, is that the rank and file, which Americans, which my parents certainly were part of, really felt that the United States had been hoodwinked into going into World War I, which they felt was an internal struggle. They felt all of Wilson's rhetoric about making the world safe for democracy and a war to end all war was nonsense. And certainly if you're looking at the 1930s, that was not World War II, whatever it did not make the world safe for democracy or be the war to end all wars. So there's a lot of cynicism in the country that would have made it hard for Roosevelt or any other leader to bring the United States in war without the United States being attacked. Comments?
Oh, I think you have to keep in mind that the show is from the Norwegian perspective.
Right,
So
yeah.
They show Martha urging aid to Norway, but they don't show Churchill at all. He was urging things. They don't show, I don't think they show the Secretary of State or the Secretary of War or a lot of other advisors. His kitchen cabinet, I think, was a group of people who advised him.
Yeah.
So you don't see those people. They're in the next room. So it looks like Martha's really influential when she was probably just one of many people who wanted the United States to be more active in defending Europe.
Right,
Yeah.
and I mean, and Henry Hopkins was a very influential advisor, but I think they sort of combined a lot of roles in there. As you said, he's going to have other advisors like George Marshall or the Henry Simpson or Cornell Hall, who's the Secretary of State. They would be wandering in and out of the discussions, but it's just too many characters to keep track of.
It starts to look like a Russian novel.
Yeah.
Right. My take on that is that Martha I think her influence, I agree with you. I think her influence was not as great as it showed in this story. But I think what we can also agree on, and most people would agree on, is that her influence made Norway more influential, if you want, than it otherwise would have been. Because that friendship gave the government a way to contact the US administration. And of course, in 41, 42, before the US was fully engaged, it may not have been that important. But then, of course, as the US became the dominant partner, at least on the Western side. So I think it gave Norway a bigger hand than it otherwise would have had. But of course, the influence was, I would guess, was still fairly small compared to, let's say, Great Britain or Canada or, other.
I have to agree. I think if she was as influential as portrayed in the show, the British would be working her much more than anyone else to get her to plant some ideas in front of the president. There's a good book, Roald Dahl and the Washington Irregulars, and it's Roald Dahl, of course, a famous writer, born in Norway but raised in England. The book, there's like two people that are very influential in Scandinavian heritage, and the princess is very close to the president, Roald Dahl is actually part of a group that sort of hangs out with Eleanor. All right. And the British, I mean, if you read the book, it's a great book on the role of the British expats, the Hollywood groups. I mean, there's a lot of movies that I guess we'd call today propaganda that come out very pro-British, at the time. They actually fund Gallup to get started so they can poll American voters, the British. And they begin to work a really effective influence campaign at all levels. I mean, even to the point of damaging German-American politicians. I mean, it's we talk about interference with the American election in 2016. Well, the British, I guess, were actively playing a role back in 1940 as well. Later, they worked to change the, basically Henry Wallace is the vice president candidate in 1944. All right, and he's seen as a little too, the British don't like him, and they work behind the scenes actually to get Harry Truman the nomination. Because they know basically Roosevelt's health is very, very bad at that time. It's a good book to read, Roald Dahl and the Washington Irregulars.
Oh, one thing that I found really intriguing when I was first starting out in this journey, I had access to Time and Newsweek magazines up at the university. And I thought it was fascinating looking back, 20 years ago, that no one knew about Norway. No one wrote about Norway or talked about Norway. But in the Time magazine and Newsweek magazines, there was usually once every other week some little something about Norway. And I was thinking at the time, why has no one talked about Norway in World War II? It might be a simple thing because often when refugees came, they were interviewed either in the States or in England, so someone would go talk to them. They bring some tidbit of what's happening, but it seemed pretty regular. They're talking about Norway and the war, and it's not, and then it wasn't talked about for like 40, 50, 60 years. So I found that really intriguing. I said, why didn't this end up in the history books about the war? But apparently they were talking about a lot in regular popular magazines like that. So, one thing that also, I'm sorry to interrupt, but another thing that happened too was John Steinbeck's The Moon is Down. I can't remember when he published the book. It became a play and then it became a movie. And I know it was smuggled into Norway in mimeograph sheets and passed around, but I think that play, that's not brought up, but that play and book could have had also, it's never named as Norway, but it's a place that sure sounds like Norway. And I think that may have also had an influence on American audiences about Norway that isn't talked about very much. But I know when he passed away, I think I have a picture from a magazine and they've got a Norwegian flag over his coffin. And he's written up about it. I have it in Norwegian talking about him.
I just looked it up. It's March 1942. And he did receive an award from King Haakon for doing that.
Yeah, so that's another public interest talking about Norway.
The next meeting I'll give you a preview, we're going to talk about books about Norway. So we'll cover that in. And if you have want to suggest good books about the topics we're talking about now or any other topics, send me an email and I'll share it with the group. When I send out the notice for this meeting, we'll tape it. I'll include the comments of books and things like that. So add that to the chat or send me an email. Any other comments?
Yeah, thanks, Bill.
Okay.
Yeah, well done, Bill.
This is Jerry, Indiana. And we just want to say thank you to everybody. It was a great program. And we're at the beach celebrating our 25th wedding anniversary at Ocean Shores.
Congratulations. Congratulations.
I'll just make one other comment. My dad met Crown Prince Olaf in Washington, D.C. on one of his visits during World War II. And I had the privilege of meeting the current Crown Prince. I think it was at Union Station for one of the receptions we had after the Christmas in Norway at Union Station. And I made a comment to him that my dad had met his grandfather. So pretty cool.
Yeah, it is. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to our speakers. I noticed on the email that Thomas did have another appointment, so he had to leave. Want to thank. Well, I'm going to email and thank him for his participation. I'd like to thank Jorgen and Janet for their participation. Everybody for joining it. We'll be making this talk available on our YouTube channel, and the next meeting will be June 27th, and we're going to make that at 3 p.m. We're going to try different times, but 3 p.m. This is try to get a time that's conducive to our friends in the West Coast and also our friends in Norway. I think 3 p.m. is probably the best compromise. So have it then. And just anyone have any quick comments before we close up? So
I just want to thank Jorgen for sending me some of that great Norwegian coffee of his.
okay.
That's
Very
great
good.
stuff.
Yes, and
I just want to say thank you. It was a very, very interesting program. And Jorgen, we're as social director of our Sons of Norway. You are hired to do a program for next year.
so yes. Okay, great. Well, thank everybody, and we'll be. You can check out more information on our website, and then we'll be talking to you the next meeting on June 27th. So, bye.